let's talk about setting up your scene and creating basically the right perspective grid and how to think about this. So we've talked about these extra concepts such as your station point, your stationary point, the center of vision, and sort of how these affect what happens when we've got 2-point perspective going on. Let's just sort of consider initially that we're starting sort of less with perspective and more with perhaps an image in mind. And what this should do is just start to talk about sort of what images are going to work and what aren't. I guess it seems like one of the biggest conceits of like rudimentary perspective, that's just this kind of concept of 1 point, 2 point, etc., is that it appears like there's this multitude of options. And really, there kind of isn't. There's things that work better than others. In the same way that sort of, photographs, just because they look real doesn't mean they always make sense. We can, as has been seen in the rise of sort of the digital age, it's very easy to make a photo that doesn't look like anything and is kind of not recognizable. So what we're after is actually good design, good thinking, and showing our scene so that it supports the story that we want to get across, so that we're being as clear as possible. And that really means that, again, if it's a scene where, you want some big sort of impressive skyscrapers, that, you sort of set your scene up so that we're looking up at them. If we're sort of looking up, sort of off a mountain or something like that, we might sort of want some more sort of impressive 3-point perspective going down. If we don't need this, that we're just sort of choosing 2-point perspective so that, we can create a good level of depth and dimension, but, not sort of, create unnecessary work for ourselves. And, perhaps also really important to understand is, if you're just sort of drawing a rendering, of something simple like a car, and, this is really about sort of showing the form that's sort of happening here. It's not about having a crazy perspective or whatever. Sometimes it can. Sometimes that can really affect the look of automotive design or something like that. And people frequently will sketch at weird perspectives to sort of push the dynamic feel of the drawing. But, that's one scenario where, you're trying to express emotion and it's more about the feel. If you're just sort of drawing something out, maybe it's concept art of a car or concept art of something, and it's sort of more at the stage where we just want to be clear about what's going on, then, you might want to sort of not have all this crazy perspective. We just want sort of something really simple so that we can just show the form and say, hey, look at this form, and people can be like, yeah, I see what's going on, now model it. That can be really useful. So in each case, we're sort of figuring out what we want our end result to be in terms of emotion, and we're thinking about how that emotion is going to be affected by basically where we are in relation to this image. So, are we sort of looking up at something? We've sort of got our picture plane and we're sort of sitting here. Are we sort of looking up, or are we looking sort of straight on? Are we looking down, etc., etc.? And where are we? Are we sort of like really close up to this car? We might sort of have some car again here. Are we sort of, crouched on the ground looking at it? Are we sort of, over here looking at it? Are we maybe, like up somewhere else? looking at it, like a lot further away. So what's going to happen is that as we look at it, sort of the frame with which we sort of look at it changes. And the distance that we look at sort of things is, and this is going to sort of affect what we see, So where you view things from affects the emotion, and it affects kind of what you see of that object, basically. Now, that's kind of fairly obvious, I guess. The trick is sort of how do you do this? And I think the best way to sort of get to grips with this is just to kind of understand how where vanishing points are affects your sort of field of view, and how that defines kind of like how far away you are from an object. And again, you can get quite technical with this and actually plot it out for each image, or you can just get a better feel for sort of what grids are likely to work, and just sort of what might be going wrong if you're trying to plan an image and your thumbnail sketches aren't quite working out. So if we just sort of think about initially, we've got horizon line, and we don't even have our sort of cone of vision. And what we do have is sort of an image somewhere that has sort of a center of vision, and that sort of defines where we are on the page. So we're here, and we've got other stuff sort of, coming out, and then other, again, perspective going different places, whatever's happening, but we don't really know where the vanishing points are, but it really depends what we want to draw in here. But it's probably, if we've got an image where there's sort of a center of vision, or the focus, not necessarily the focus, just sort of where we're sitting, this actually defines a lot of how you'll see the images. Obviously, if we're sitting here and our head is here and we look sort of over here, we're going to see the side of objects. And over here, we're going to see the side of objects. And that's if it's sort of in 1 point perspective. If it's in 2 point perspective, again, you're still going to sort of see the sides of objects. It all depends sort of what's going on. So this is important. And basically, we talked before about that concept of having a cone of vision, where we're sort of looking at an object. Again, we're sort of on the ground, and if you sort of have a again, some sort of very weird car. What we kind of want to do is we want to sort of have this car in our cone of vision so that we can see it all. And this is sort of, so if you imagine that you kind of have a camera here, right? What's really important to understand here is this concept that we talked about before, that sort of, if we're here, this is sort of the same as this line. So let's grab this. So we're the same as this. This is the same as this line over here, where we're sort of, this is what we're looking at. It's just that we're drawing it down because we can't draw it on, like coming at us. And we are sort of here. And you can see here, in order to get all of this in, I'm going to have to use a certain angle, right? Because if I can't, then I sort of can't fit this whole image in to the picture plane. And the picture plane is just sort of like the two-dimensional object you're drawing on. So here I sort of can't, or I can, but I have to use a certain sort of angle. And if I try and find my angle, where it was here we go. Let's see whether this fits. So if I'm kind of here, what you can see is that it's going to be quite difficult for me to fit this car in. maybe if let's copy this guy over, we'll sort of we can start to play around with this. So again, this stuff is kind of, it's a bit more sort of theory, but what we need to do is sort of, you need to link yourself with the center of vision. Here we go. So sort of to fit it in, what you need to do is sort of start to step back a bit. And this is the same, you can imagine this is if you've got a camera and your camera can only do this sort of 60 degrees. It's not wide enough. Then you need to sort of step back so you can get it all in, right? Or you might be able to sort of view it from a different angle, right? That might help you. You know, like if you sort of went around the front, obviously it's a lot, you know, you have less to fit in the front. You could sort of go a lot closer and get sort of really close, and probably you could fit it all in. And you get a lot of sort of that extreme perspective, but probably still it would look sort of okay, you know, or you could view it from an angle. So again, it might seem abstract because it's like, well, why am I talking about this if we're sort of drawing this perspective stuff? But this is what, like how far back we are and what we can fit in a cone of vision is something that works in reality. That's something that's very easy to understand. It's also something that comes into play here. And what we need to do is figure out sort of where the stationary point is, like where are we, so that we can like make measurements. And then of course, when we draw 45 degrees, 90 degrees, to get sort of a right angle for our vanishing points, then we're actually doing it from here, which is going to define sort of how close the vanishing points are, and that will sort of define that kind of standard cube, which will give you sort of true perspective in this cone of vision. So again, sounds like a lot of sort of stuff. Let's have a go. So we've got sort of center of vision, which is kind of, you know, and if it's a camera, it's going to be sort of in the middle of the page. But, you know, we can sort of put it anywhere, right? And in the same way that we can sort of put this page anywhere. But what you'll see with this, need a circle. What you'll see with this sort of thing is that the center of vision and the circle, right, is sort of linked more or less to your center of vision. So the cone of vision is linked to your like where you're looking on the page, and that should be kind of like fairly obvious. But basically, like there you can see this kind of cone of vision relates to this. But but what we need to figure out is sort of how far back it starts, because if it starts kind of here, right, then obviously we can fit more in, and we might need to fit more in. If it goes really close, then obviously this circle needs to get smaller. So it can fit. So that's kind of dynamic. So basically what you need to do is that you need to match the picture plane the bit of paper that we're actually rendering to this circle, and make sure that the circle is then relating back to your stationary point at this degree. And if you do that, then everything lines up. Again, sounds kind of complicated. It's not too complicated. But remember that the cone of vision is relating to the stationary point and your center of vision. It's not relating to where the box is, right? So we don't necessarily draw a circle around the box unless we're sort of in film mode, in which case the center of vision is always in the middle. And in that case, we could just sort of move that round. But here, what we need to do is we need to make sure that all of this area in this box is kind of within a cone of vision that is at sort of 60 degrees, like 30 degrees either side of your sort of stationary point center line. So if I have an image like this, where this is kind of horizon line is here, and I'm not really sure where the vanishing points are yet, I don't have a grid, then yeah, the key is to make sure that basically it just fits within that the cone of vision fits. And if we kind of do this, we can see it fits. And we can think about like what's the smallest sort of circle we could make where this fits, where we're kind of it's probably about there. So it's like drawing out these lines. And so what that means is that now if we get our cone of vision and we sort of make it like this, so that these points are lining up. Now, let's draw this line. Now, if I kind of move it back, I need to move it back until it kind of lines up. The circle is not quite lined up. There you go, that's a bit better. So yeah, now I have a good idea back down here. This is now where the stationary point needs to be. And what that means is that this image, everything in this image is kind of contained within that cone of vision. And again, there's many ways that you can kind of do this, or there's probably like one or two ways you can do this. If you're kind of in this, if you're not looking at it from a long distance. But probably also it's important to understand that when you're planning out images, frequently we're doing it as a thumbnail. And this is one of the big reasons we do it as a thumbnail, is that we can actually sort of see and plan at least a little bit. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be quite this detailed, but we can sort of see and sort of plan and go, right, I need a circle around there, which means that this is going to be sort of here. And an easy way to sort of understand what's happening is that if you need to find this point, what we can do is we can simply draw a line here. And figure out how long that line is. So again, this is sort of, it's 24 centimeters, 23 and a half. Now we just swing this up, it's 23 and a half. And you've got a point here. And now we can just draw this line from here to here. And now you've got your stationary point. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's easier to explain it to begin with as this being a cone of vision, and then we think about, okay, if this is what we need, how do we find this? So if you have an image that is like this, and we have a sort of, okay, horizon lines here, this is where center of vision is, and perspective is like somewhere off here, but I'm not exactly sure. But if I want to make sure everything in this image is sort of at like a reasonable, there's no massive distortion where, you know, we've got like, oh, I've got 2 vanishing points on the page, you know, so it's going to look like this, and it's going to be like really sort of wide angle lens. If you want to make sure, okay, vanishing points are like well off the page, I'm not entirely sure where, but I also want these vanishing points to sort of be, mean that I've got like a, sort of a nice like 45 degrees, solid looking image. And this vision is sort of based, this vision cone is sort of based on our vision cone. It approximates what we see at the center of our vision. We have peripheral vision, but it doesn't sense depth and things in the same way that the sort of center of our vision does. So yeah, I want to kind of have, okay, center of vision is somewhere along here. Vanishing points are somewhere off here. I don't know where they are, but I'd like to get some so I can get a grid that's not all whacked out. Then what we do is you draw a, obviously we're drawing this line because this is the longest line. And this is sort of, if you think about it, this is going to be the radius of the circle that we need to get there. So let's say if we've got this line here, that's the longest. We need to measure that. Again, it's about 21.5. Let's go down to here for 21.5. Got a point there. We know that this is a stationary point. And what's left is to draw a line going here somewhere, but we want this angle to be 30 degrees. And so again, how you find that is sort of tricky, dealing digitally. The best way to just sort of explain it here is just to kind of go, okay, if we get our sort of 30-degree line and kind of put it there, now we've got our stationary point. And now what you can do is sort of, again, if you want vanishing points here, we can sort of go out like this, and then if we use this as a basis and rotate these, i.e. our vanishing points have like a combined sort of angle here of 90 degrees, then this is going to mean that these vanishing points are going to represent something which is sort of square. And that's kind of where we start. So we kind of might go, we could go like here. And then we've got a vanishing point over here and a vanishing point here. And now if we draw things like this, we're going to get kind of still perspective, still all that stuff going on, but it's going to be all going to feel like, oh, yep, I'm kind of seeing a thing. So, you know, if you're sort of drawing a house or something, that we're not going to get that weird sort of distortion stuff happening that we sort of normally get. And often, you know, as you can imagine, it's sort of really, we're doing all this perspective, but we kind of need to be sort of in here when we're actually drawing. And again, if you get this, let's see if I can grab this thing here. What should happen is, as I make this smaller, it should fit, it should line up here, fit within the cone of vision, and sort of fit the whole picture plane in. So you can see it's fitting that in there. And so that's kind of the basics. Now, again, sometimes it's a lot easier to do these things, especially with the angles, when you have an actual sort of, I forget what it's called, thing with all the degrees on it, and you can sort of measure degrees. Anyway, there's lots of sort of traditional, doesn't seem like a lot of the rulers and stuff are terribly good at that. You could probably do it with the line tool just by doing the math in your head and saying like, say it's sort of like 120, this is like 120 degrees. So 120 is where it would be, because this is sort of 180, and if we sort of go here, like 60 minus 180 is 120. You can do that again. Math, we're not sort of want to think of ways to do it which is not sort of totally mathematical, because most artists aren't into math like that. But that's kind of what you would do. But probably more important than this is just understanding that certain grids are going to look better, and certain relationships of, you can see that there's probably like, frequently with this cone of vision, what you're going to get is a sort of a triangle that looks a lot like this. Like these triangles look a lot the same, and they're not exactly the same. And probably if I just sort of drew this down roughly like this, it might not be exact, but it would be a lot closer than, say, if I'm sort of saying, okay, I want to sort of draw this image, and I've got this thing here, and then I'm going to put, let me say, okay, I need this, and this sort of goes all the way over here. So we're sort of, it's like we're rotating this to kind of start to, have like a compass and create a circle around there. So I say, okay, now I'm going to put this, but actually my stationary point is down here, right? And that means that you're much closer to this image, and then I'm going to say, okay, now I've got, now you can see that sort of putting this perspective in is going to be, is going to yield a completely different result. This is like you're much closer to something. And again, you can see that if I draw sort of 60 degrees from here, we're very far off this image being in sort of a good level of distortion. So all the stuff around here is going to be way distorted. Probably like even stuff around here is going to look like completely distorted. If you try and draw a character over here, they're going to be sort of like looking weird, and it's sort of weird here. Yeah, and if you sort of think of like, okay, this is the cone of vision. So again, it's going to be somewhere like here. So lots of this image is way off. So that's not going to work. It's going to have that sort of widescreen look. Now, if that's what you want, that's fine. But probably what you can sort of start to see is that the setup looks a bit different. And this is what we need to pay attention to. So here we've got this kind of triangle, which defines like your cone of vision. Again, sort of cone of vision sort of around there. That's what you'd need. Instead, we've got cone of vision sort of around here. And yeah, cone of vision here versus cone of vision here is gonna need and look. It's going to give you a completely different triangle sort of configuration. So what you can probably just say is that, right, if I'm drawing an image like this and I want, sort of, okay, horizon line there is, center line is kind of there. Maybe there's going to be a triangle like this, right? And that means you're probably going to be way closer just by guesstimating this. And then sort of saying like, okay, now I want some sort of lines going down here. And I'm going to make this 90 degrees, and then I'm going to have perspective grid going each ways. And now it's going to sort of, yeah, that this is going to work. So even just doing a little bit of stuff like that has made my life a lot easier. And you can see that when you're doing this in thumbnail stage, it's actually quite easy to sort of do that, and then just kind of like erase this and be like, okay, now here's my grid, sort of, roughly like this, roughly like that. And this is going to give me a good look. And again, like you can say, okay, stationary point is down here, and etc. So you can do a thumbnail like this, and it's quite decent, and you get a decent sort of approximation. Then what happens when you blow this up, right, to actually work on it, you can sort of ignore that stuff. And then you can actually, if we kind of create a new one, you can sort of, you've got your sketch in here, we've got some rough sort of lines here, or you might have something drawn. And what you can do is then drop a grid, one of those other grids that we've sort of seen before, over the top of this. Make sure it's all sort of sitting along this horizon line, and that's actually going to give you. We know that these vanishing points are vanishing to a good degree. Everything's sort of working. This is in our cone of vision, and now I have a grid on here, and you can just draw to your heart's content with a much more detailed grid, and not sort of worry about all that stuff. So that's kind of how it can work. And obviously, the best thing to do is to sort of play around with these sort of measurements and angles and see if you can get some different sort of perspective shots working. But probably the one that's the best to sort of start with is just trying to get it to look sort of normal. And then once you've got that, then you can play around with sort of different baseline looks. And yeah, understand that sort of, yeah, as you can also sort of see here, something else is that, again, if we have a sort of picture plane, and this is why I often give the advice that if you have one vanishing point on the page and it's 2-point perspective, the other one is going to be way off, right? Because if we have sort of a center line here, and then what happens is that I draw this sort of vanishing point goes down to our stationary point. If I want this to be sort of true, and I want these things to sort of relate, and these two vanishing points to be describing, again, flat, if this was on flat on the ground, a square, so that, both of these are sort of going at 90 degrees to each other, then you can see that this one is going to be way off over here. So yeah, important to understand that this is kind of, and just get in your head a feeling for, okay, if I put a vanishing point on the page sort of here, then the other one's going to be way off here. You don't necessarily need to be doing all this, although it will help, but that will give you an understanding of sort of like, okay, I'm doing some thumbnails, and then if you sort of get a feel for like, okay, what does this grid look like on the page when I draw it, right? And you can sort of see, okay, and you get a feeling for remembering what this grid looks like. Then when you come here and you are just sort of like, okay, I've got a horizon line and I want to sort of put in some rough grid lines to do a thumbnail, you can sort of go, I remember what it was like, is that these ones come from way over here, and this is still like a true perspective grid. This one works. So that's kind of the key, is to sort of, yeah, understand how all these things kind of work, how they play together. And the more that you can do that, the easier it will be to create good scenes and not get yourself into trouble. And if ever you're kind of like creating something and you're like, look, I can't figure out how to do it, then you can go back on your sketch page where you're trying to figure out your thumbnail. You can do some of this to actually figure out, look, I have a specific scene in mind, but like, how close am I to the what's going on? How are all these things interacting, and what's going on? So this is one of those things where once you get a handle for this, you get a good feel for what works. You just do it. It looks good. That's fine. You don't need to really worry about all these technical things. If ever you get stuck, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not sure what's going on, then we go back to the basics and say like, right, what's going wrong with this image? Why does it not look like I want it to look? And whereabouts is the stationary point in this image, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some basic concepts we can use to help set up a scene. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways you can do this. As I said before, the the best way to kind of get your head around this is just to experiment, and to experiment with little thumbnails. So, fill sketchbook full of just little sort of thumbnails where you're sort of sketching out environments and just playing around with different perspectives. If you do this enough, you'll just get a good feel for it. And the more that you can understand this, I really suggest you kind of try and replicate these concepts and try them out, because these are the kind of things, they're almost like, it's like a math puzzle where if you get it right, you get it right. And if you can sort of replicate this concept, it should work every single time. So if you can get this sort of thing working just by sort of copying it and trying to get it working, I think you'll understand how these things are all affecting each other.